Sometimes we make advertising or we do work that benefits the consumer. Other times we've got our own personal motivations. We all want to look good with our peers.
Now today we have another remarkable guest for you, Richard Shotton on the show. Welcome, Richard.
There are some studies that suggest if you genuinely open flaws, if you genuinely admit your flaws, you're likely to become more appealing. If you've had a degree of success or a degree of ability, being open about flaws is actually something that will make you more believable.
Richard is a renowned behavioral scientist and author and specializes in applying psychological insights to marketing.
What the psychologists argue is that the more effort we put into something, the more we appreciate it.
Richard is probably best known for his best-selling book, The Choice Factory, which delves into 25 behavioral biases influences consumer decisions.
We're always thinking about how we can remove effort and friction from the customer journey. And 99.9% of the time, that is the right thing to do.
So today, we're going to hear more about a range of behavioral theories, as well as learn about Richard's own journey.
So today's episode is of course brought to you by two fantastic organisations. The first, Studio Space, a leading on-demand marketing agency platform. This enables marketers to browse and brief agencies, receive proposals and start work all in one place. It's literally like having your own agency network at your fingertips, without the hassle, as they take care of everything from contracting, invoicing, procurement to legal. So check out Studio Space today. Our other sponsor, of course, is the Marketing Skills Trust, a charity whose mission is to make the marketing industry a better place, providing grants to help create a more equitable industry and help us to level up. The Marketing Skills Trust has been instrumental in championing a more inclusive, diverse and open marketing industry. You can find out more by going to their website. Okay, let's get on with the show.
Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the Places We'll Go show. Now today, we have another remarkable guest for you, Richard Shotton on the show. Welcome, Richard.
Very nice to meet you.
So fabulous to have you on, Richard. Been looking forward to this one for ages. I'm fascinated. Like, can't wait for the third book. Need to have forewarning of when it's available. I don't know what you can say, but can you just give us maybe one example of...
One chapter that finished reasonably recently was on Amazon Prime, and the bias that we looked at there was this idea of sunk costs. So some lovely experimentation. The original study was done by a psychologist called Hal Arks. I think it's at Ohio University back in early 80s. And he gets a group of people. It's a bit of a thought experiment. He does later studies which are more real world, but this is a kind of, I think, a very clear one. Gets a group of participants and says, look, imagine you've bought a skiing holiday. You've spent $100 and you're going to have a weekend in Wisconsin, and it's going to be good. You then buy another skiing holiday, weekend away in Michigan, $50, and it's going to be amazing. Later on, you find out these two holidays have accidentally been booked on exactly the same weekend. You can't go on both, and you cannot get your money back. Which holiday would you go on? And what he finds, but what he's essentially asking is, do you want to go on a $100 holiday that's good or a $50 holiday that's amazing? Now, if people were logical, everyone should pick the $50 holiday. That's the one that's going to be amazing. You know, the money's been spent. All you should care about is the enjoyment you get. But that's not what happens. A slight majority of people, I think it's 55 or 60% of people, pick the less good, more expensive holiday. Now, this is one of the first times people have shown this idea of sunk costs, which is essentially, if you have spent money on something, that money, even if it's gone, it's been expended, that money will affect later behaviour, even to illogical degrees. So the amazing thing with Amazon Prime is once you've spent that money on a subscription, let's say theoretically you could buy the Choice Factory either for $9.99 on Amazon and get it tomorrow, or $8.99 on WH Smith and get it tomorrow. Many people would still go for the Amazon option because they hate that idea of feeling they have wasted that previous spend. So I think it's a fascinating bias. We're seeing people starting to use this more, But there's still plenty of opportunity for brands to start thinking, how can we get people to pay something up front? Because once they've done that, they will go to these ludicrous lengths to try and recoup that investment.
I'd say it's almost like they've made a decision and then looking to constantly reinforce the fact that they've made the decision in the first place and validate the fact that they were right. And it's almost like that consistency bias. I think that's what it was termed. In fact, we had Professor Robert Cialdini on the show not so long ago. He was amazing. He was an amazing stalwart of the industry. And he talked about that confirmation sort of bias that individuals have. And it sounds very much familiar as you described Amazon Prime. And actually, interestingly, of course, we're in the midst of just coming across and finishing the Amazon Prime Day for this year, which was over the last 2 days. And in fact, record numbers of people making investments in their TVs and home furnishings and all the like on Amazon Prime over the last couple of days as well. So quite relevant. But interestingly, I bought a telly on Amazon Prime, the Prime Day, 2 days ago, in fact. And I found that interesting because Les Binet did a study on pricing and particularly about the level of which, you're doing price discounting is a good thing or a bad thing. And in fact, I kind of think I fell into this because I needed a TV anyway. And yet Amazon Prime just that day fell on the right moment and I got a discounted TV when I probably would have bought one anyway. So I thought it was quite interesting that I was a live example of what Les Binet was talking about when it comes to pricing theory. And in fact, that sometimes discounting isn't the best thing to be doing.
Yeah, so I think like it's a fascinating point you make there. The first one around that idea of consistency, I completely agree with you. I think an awful lot of that sunk cost effect is people wanting to explain and look like sensible, rational people. And if you have spent money on Amazon Prime membership and then don't use it, you feel wasteful, you feel silly, you feel like you're being mugged off. You can almost concoct this story by continuing to do illogical things, but allow you to have peace of mind by telling yourself it was a sensible investment. So I think you're absolutely right. It's all about this kind of self-image. I think your other area around price reductions is a fascinating one. I think there's an awful lot of overlap between behavioural science and some of the work Les Binet does. So there's a wonderful study by Baba Shiv at Stanford. And it's one of my favourite studies. Recruits group people, serves them 5 different bottles of wine, and I'm emphasising bottle on purpose. And each bottle has a prominent price label. But the twist in the experiment is one of the wines is repeated. So people are drinking a Merlot at the beginning. They have a sip of the Merlot and then they rate it. They think it comes from a $5 bottle and they say it tastes awful. A few minutes later, they're drinking exactly the same Merlot, but it comes from a completely different bottle with this price label of $45. And people say it tastes amazing. Now, Shiv gets them to quantify those ratings, and he finds that when people drink out of the $45 bottle, they will rate that wine 70% higher than when it comes out of the $5 bottle. So according to Shiv, what we expect affects our experience to a degree. And one of the things that sets expectation for the quality of a wine or any product is the price. So absolutely fine to discount a product occasionally, but if your discounting is too deep, if it's too regular, you're essentially training your customer to think your product's not very high quality. And not only will that change their mental image of your product, it will actually change the end experience as well. So I think you're absolutely right to sound a note of caution about discount.
This is also fascinating. Now, my sort of hackneyed basic understanding of the neuroscience that goes into behavioural nudges and so on is myelination, it's patterns in the brain. But give us your perspective on what's actually going on in the brain with all of these nudges.
So I think there are two kind of different fields of study. I mean, there's definitely overlap, but there's neuroscience where they might shove people in an fMRI and tell us about bits of the brain lighting up. And that's never really been my speciality, because I've always felt slight skepticism towards outsourcing insights to someone else, some kind of expert who can magically read these brain scans and tell us what's going on. Now, I'm sure if you try neuroscientists on, they would tell you a far more lucid story about why it's amazing. But behavioural science is slightly different. most experiments are like Halarks or Cialdinis or Babashivs, where you set up a simple naturalistic setting and you run 2 versions and you change one tiny attribute between those 2 versions, and then any difference in response you attribute back to the single change variable. Now, if that all sounds a little bit abstract, I'll give you a Cialdini example. He famously did a study into social proof. So his hypothesis was we are deeply influenced by what other people do, and it's often more effective to stress lots of people do something rather than giving them a long list of rational reasons to change. So I'll simplify the study a bit, but basically what he does, he finds a hotel chain in Southwest USA, persuades that hotel chain to let him alter the messages that run in guest rooms, encouraging people to reuse their towels. And half of the rooms have a door hanger which says, please reuse your towels, it's good for the environment. And when he does that, 35% of guests comply. Other set of rooms, he runs a message saying, please reuse your towels. Most guests in this room have done so. Most guests who've stayed in this room have done so. And when he does that, he finds that 49% of people reuse their towels. So you get this 40% improvement in compliance. Now, if you think about the methodology behind that, what he's done is found a naturalistic setting. People do not know they're in an experiment. He's found a hotel, genuine real-world guests are going to that hotel. They do not know that a psychologist is playing with the messaging in the room. Half the people see the door hanger with the environment message. Half see the message with the social proof claim. And what Cialdini can do is say that any difference, because everything else was the same between these 2 sets of rooms, any change in reuse the towel rates he can attribute back to that bias being used. And that is a classic methodology for a behavioural science study. And why I really love these studies is there's nothing hidden away. There's nothing complex. You can take that to a marketer who's never heard of behavioural science. You can explain it in maybe 5 minutes, but get a bit more depth and the nuances and the third variant that he actually did. You can explain it, and then straight away, you and that marketer are on a level playing field. The insight is the insight, and it's very clearly demonstrated. You can then move on to the really important bit, which is how you then take that finding and apply it and change the work that you're doing. But yeah, I think that's the basic difference between the behavioural science approach and the neuroscience approach.
I love the distinction there, and thank you for being able to explain it so succinctly. In fact, as you talk about that experiment, and in fact the concept of social proofing is perhaps one of the most well-known across the behavioral science industry and perhaps among the popularists of the discipline. And I was listening to a talk that you were on, and you were referring to another Cialdini experiment, which I thought was fascinating because although many people talk to sort of social proofing as being a positive effect, and that the way you described that recycling of towels, it can actually almost have a negative effect too. And I wondered if you could perhaps elaborate on that as well, because I think that's a little bit more novel than the way it's popularly done.
Yeah, absolutely. So social proof's a lovely example to discuss because its roots go all the way back to the 1930s. There was a Turkish-American psychologist called Muzaffer Sherif, and he did some of the first studies into what he would call conformity, how we copy what others are doing. Because there's this almost 100 years of experimentation, there's a phenomenal amount of nuance to the idea. There's a lot of experiments that have brought out some of the little tactics that you can do to kind of sweat out maximum advantage. One of the studies, though, I think that you're referring to is almost where social proof goes wrong. And this basic principle, if you stress a behaviour as commonplace, it will become more common still. That can work for good or bad. So if you stress lots of people are buying your product, especially lots of similar people to the audience, you will encourage purchasing. That's when it's being used to positive effect. But unfortunately, sometimes it's inadvertently used in the wrong direction. If you go out and say loads of people don't vote, expect fewer votes next time. If you say loads of companies don't have women on their board, you'll make the situation worse. If you say loads of youths carry knives, you'll make the situation worse. Now, that's not speculation. There's a 2003 study from Cialdini where he works with the Petrified Wood National Park in Arizona. And he's picked this park because loads of people are going to it and stealing bits of petrified wood as a memento, as a souvenir. So he wants to know what happens if you tell visitors that lots of others are stealing. He finds a deserted bit of the park. There's a path, middle of nowhere. He hides CCTV cameras and he points them towards the path, and he sprinkles bits of petrified wood along the path. So anyone who goes down that walkway has a chance to steal. He then puts up a sign. Well, first of all, he measures what the run rate of theft is. And when there's no sign at all, I think it's 2.9% of people steal a bit of wood. He then puts up a sign saying, don't steal, it's wrong. And theft rates drop to 1.7%. So essentially, he's showing you can change this negative behaviour. But the real bit of the experiment, and the bit that refers to what you're saying, in the next version of the experiment, he puts up a sign saying 12 tonnes of wood are being stolen each year and it's ruining the look of the park. Don't steal. Now, when he does that, there is an almost tripling of theft rates. You've got somewhere between a doubling and a tripling of theft rates. You've got 7.9% of people stealing a bit of wood. Now, in Cialdini's words, this is a crime promotion strategy, not a crime prevention strategy. What he argues is if you stress that lots of people are behaving antisocially, you remove a sense of transgression and you make that negative behaviour more likely to occur. Actually, if you look at around an awful lot of social good advertising, government advertising, you see this mistake again and again and again. Now, you go into a doctor's surgery and there are often signs saying 256 people didn't bother coming to their appointment last month. I can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to shock people into positive behaviour. What it actually does is think, well, everyone else is doing it. It can't be that bad. Maybe if my little Johnny doesn't want to get up today, well, if I miss the doctor's appointment, so many other people doing it, it's not really a big issue. Yeah, if you stress that an unwanted behaviour is happening regularly, that message tends to backfire and it makes the problem worse.
I know exactly where I'm going to go and apply that one later today. Anyway, changing subject slightly. So there's a very famous quote by Bill Bernbach. If your advertising goes unnoticed, everything else is academic. And many adverts basically just get ignored, don't really hit a memory threshold. So maybe the most important job of a marketer is to get that advert to be noticed. So what advice would you give to marketers to achieve this?
So there's quite a lot of studies into noticeability. Probably the most simple to apply, and again, one of the oldest in behavioural science, is the von Restorff effect. So the original studies were by Hedwig von Restorff, University of Berlin, back in 1933. And she didn't quite do this, but basically what she did was give people lists of words. So one participant might see 10 words on a piece of paper, 9 are animals, 1's an item of furniture. They'd have a minute or two to read through that list. Von Restorff would take the list away and then ask people what they could remember. And what she found was if you give people lists mainly composed of animals with just one distinctive bit of furniture, it's the furniture they remember. Or vice versa, if you give people lists mainly composed of furniture with a couple of animals sprinkled in, it'll be the animals that they remember. So that became known as the von Restorff effect, the isolation effect. It's essentially this idea that we notice what is distinctive. Now, that study was done over 90 years ago, but it has been repeated again and again and again. This is not a fashion or a fad. This is something hardwired into people. Now, marketers can take that principle and apply it, because what I think people do too often is they identify their category conventions and then they cling to them. But von Restorff would say this is absolutely the wrong thing to do. This is the route to invisibility. What you want to do instead as a marketer is make a massive list of all the conventions of your category and then go through them one by one and think, well, which ones are there for a very good reason? Leave those well alone. Which are just convention? And if you break those ones, you're tapping into a very well-known bias, a very long-standing, well-proven bias, and you're boosting that probability of being noticed. And as Bernbach says, everything else is academic unless you achieve that goal. So yeah, identifying category conventions and being selective in which ones you break would be a really simple way of applying behavioural science to that challenge.
Richard, it's interesting. There was another study that you referred to and alluded to, and I think this is sometimes where marketers really fall or trip over their own feet in many respects. And I think it was the argument being is that we try and serve ourselves as opposed to the consumer. And in fact, we sort of try and create advertising in our, not necessarily in our own like or vein, but actually as a consequence of trying to prove something to the industry, as it were. One of the sort of anecdotes that you related to was the world of rhyme, and when we're trying to create sort of jingles and the like, and how unfashionable they have become. Not necessarily because they're unfashionable with their consumer. In fact, they're very powerful as a memory structure or a memory tool, but more so because they don't convey a sense of perhaps fame, intelligence, or whatever it might be with our own colleagues. And I'd love maybe if you could elaborate a little bit on that and that notion and that dynamic.
So I think there's a couple of things going on. The first is, you mentioned that we often make advertising our own image. I think that's definitely true. There's an idea in behavioural science called the false consensus effect. So the original study was another thought experiment by Lee Ross, I think it was at Stanford, back in 1977. He says to people, imagine you are driving through, let's say, a 30-mile-an-hour zone, and you're driving 35 miles an hour. Policeman spots you, pulls you over speeding, as you were, gives you a ticket. But when you get home, you realise the ticket is riddled with errors. So maybe wrong date, wrong time, wrong model of the car. You have a choice. Do you accept the fine that you've been given because you were speeding? Or do you contest it because you might get off on a technicality? And people answer that question. And then the real experiment starts. He says, what do you think others would do? And what he finds is if a participant would have accepted the fine, they think the majority of others would accept the fine. If people would have contested, they think most people would contest as well. What we tend to do is take our beliefs, experience, behaviours, and extrapolate them onto other people. Now, it's not completely black and white. People don't think that what they do is the same as what everyone else does, but we overestimate the occurrence of our own behaviour. So if you vote green or you drink Smirnoff, you don't think everyone drinks Smirnoff, everyone votes green, but you will overestimate the proportion of people do. So as a marketer, you've got a bit of an issue. If you have a particular mindset or background or affluence level, and we all have this kind of heritage and specific set of circumstances, the danger is you assume that your audience are more likely to be the same than they actually are. And that is a problem, I think, not just from our backgrounds, which are never universal, but also our relationship with our own products. That's probably the biggest differentiator with the audience. We really care about this thing. We think about it 40 hours a week. For our audience, it's a blindingly small part of their life. So you're absolutely right that there is a danger to make advertising that we think would work on ourselves. So I think that's absolutely true. The other point you mentioned was around
the rhyming slang and the fashionability of it.
Yeah, I think there is an issue there that we're all guilty of this. Me as much as anyone else. That sometimes we make advertising or we do work that benefits the consumer. Other times we've got our own personal motivations. We all want to look good with our peers. And I think this is where rhyme falls down. It doesn't feel sophisticated if we're with a group of marketers and creatives or strategists. So it's something that I think has fallen out of fashion, not because, as you said, it doesn't influence consumers, but because we feel a little bit old-fashioned and out of date to be recommending it in a world of AI and groundbreaking technology. But you're absolutely right. The evidence in terms of sticking in people's memory is very, very, very strong. So there's a probably early 2000s, late 90s study into what's called the Keats heuristic by Matthew McGlone and Jessica Topic-Bash. And what they did was show that rhymes tend to be more believed than non-rhyming statements. So they recruit a group of people and they give them a list of, say, 10 fake proverbs. So one might say, woes unite foes. And they ask people to rate how believable they are. They then have another group of people who see the same list of proverbs, but the rhyming ones have been changed to non-rhyming versions. The non-rhyming ones have been made into rhyming versions. So if in that first group people saw woes unite foes, the second group would see woes unite enemies. And what the two psychologists found was that if someone saw that statement in a rhyming version, they were about 10 or 15% more likely to think it was a genuine insight into human nature. It was believable and trustworthy. Now, no one knew that it was the rhyme that was doing that. And when they were asked directly, they denied it. But that became known as the Keats heuristic. And it's essentially the idea that because rhyme makes something easier to process, we conflate ease of processing with truthfulness. Now, I took that study. I did a pilot version, because it was just on marketing people. We did the same basic study, but rather than asking people whether they believed the claim, we asked them whether they, we gave them the list in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we asked them what they could remember. And people were twice as likely to remember the rhyme over the non-rhyming version. This is something that is a brilliant way of sticking into people's minds. You know, if children's authors, they know this very well. You know, rhyme is something that's a tactic used for memory in that situation. Yeah, I think you're right, Richie, because it doesn't reflect very well on us. We are loath to recommend it as professionals.
Amazing. I just have to just one more little interesting anecdote. I was on LinkedIn yesterday and I saw a post by Richard Huntington from Saatchi's, and he posted this lovely picture of a spaghetti brand that basically had a rhyme which was spaghetti you won't forgetty.
Yes, yes.
And he said he was going to be talking about it all day long. So there you go.
It's something that I think people recognize. You know, you see an awful lot of like self-generated content that rhymes. You know, no marbs before carbs. You know, that is something that people have generated themselves. It wasn't an ad agency, a professional group that came up with it. People are much more likely to use these tactics and not see them, you know, as a negative thing because it happens to rhyme. It's just a way of embedding something into the brain.
This all makes so much sense when you explain it so clearly and plainly. You touched on this at a personal level and a peer level. So I'm interested about how you would apply this in terms of, you know, your own self, your own brand, maybe being, you know, how do you be authentic and relatable in the workplace? Is there applications there?
Absolutely. So one of the most interesting biases, I think, in terms of authenticity and kind of personal areas is an idea called the pratfall effect. So I think often when brands talk about authenticity, they kind of use it as a euphemism for talking about their own very strong ethics. You could argue that's not really what authenticity is. Authenticity is being yourself, warts and all. And there are some studies that suggest if you genuinely open flaws, not humble brag and talk about what a great ethical person you are, if you genuinely admit your flaws, you're likely to become more appealing. So there's a 1966 study from a Harvard psychologist called Elliot Aronson. Lovely, simple study. Recruits a colleague, gets the colleague to take part in a quiz. Aronson gives the contestant all the answers. So guy gets 92% of the questions right, wins the quiz by miles, looks like a complete genius. But then, as the quiz is finishing, he makes what America in the 1960s would call a pratfall. He makes a small blunder. He spills a cup of coffee down himself. Aronson has recorded all of this. He takes that recording and he plays it to a new group of listeners. But the twist in the experiment is sometimes he plays the entire footage, other times he edits out the spillage. Key finding is that when those participants are asked to rate the appeal of the contestant, the ones who've heard the entire footage with the spillage, they rate the contestant, 45, 55% more appealing than the people that haven't heard the spillage. So Aronson's argument is, he calls this the pratfall effect. It's essentially this idea that if we exhibit or admit a flaw, we become more appealing. Now, there are nuances to this. In the setup I've just described, the participant had a degree of status. He'd done amazingly well at this quiz, and that's certainly a nuance to the pratfall effect. If you've done awfully at the quiz and then spill a cup of coffee down yourself, it doesn't help. But if you've had a degree of success or a degree of ability, being open about flaws is actually something that will make you more believable. And according to other experiments, more appealing according to Aronson, and according to other experiments, more believable.
Tell us a bit about the IKEA experiment, the IKEA effect, because that's one that doesn't come up in conversation that much, but again, a really, really powerful one.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So it was a Dan Ariely study. He did it with Michael Norton. There might have been a third experiment as well. So back in 2012, they recruit a group of people and they bring them into their lab, and after they've done a few other puzzles, I think, they've given them their fee for taking part. And then they say, look, here's your $5, whatever it was. You can have that, it's yours to keep. But before you go, here's a professionally assembled IKEA box where you can store your CDs. How much of your money that we've just given you do you want to bid on that box? And I think the average bid was 48 cents. Next group of people, they go through the same rigmarole. They get to that stage of bidding on the box, but this time the box hasn't been made. It is just all the spare parts lying on the floor. The participant has to build the box, and once they build the box, they are then asked to bid on it. And the average bid goes from 48 cents in that first setting, I think, to 78 cents. So you've got this 63% improvement in bid level. What the psychologists argue is that the more effort we put into something, the more we appreciate it. Now, they did that study with the box. They then repeated that study with lots of different things. They did it with origami birds, for example. They kept on proving this same point. The more effort you put in something, the more you appreciate it. So that, to me, is a fascinating one for marketers. And we're always thinking about how we can remove effort and friction from the customer journey. And 99.9% of the time, that is the right thing to do. Now, it's a repeated finding of behavioural science experiments. If you make something easier, it will happen more often. And the insight often happens to a greater degree than you would normally expect. So removing friction has disproportionate impact. But the IKEA effect suggests, well, if it's quality perceptions that you want to improve, well, then be very careful about removing all the friction. Sometimes people use that effort they've expended as a proxy for quality of the product. Now, if you're a wine, actually forcing people to expend effort to get to the liquid with a cork, that will bolster your quality perceptions. Whereas if you just allow them to, pull off the screw top in a couple of seconds, you're not going to have the same effect. And if you look around at a few different examples, you can see that in action. So I used to love San Pellegrino lids, where you had the foil lid that you had to pull off. It took a little bit of effort to get to the product. The Apple box, when it arrives, the iPhone, you don't just tear open the Amazon-like packaging. It's this lovely box where the friction has almost been perfectly added. It does take a little bit of resistance and drag to get it open. Now, all these bits of effort are making you appreciate the product a little bit more.
Sticking on the topic of customer experience, I think this is really, really interesting. And in fact, you speak a lot about the thought that there are, and in fact, in customer experience more generally, there's this notion of moments of truth. And what you've been able to identify is that there are key moments within the building blocks of an experience which, one, end up being more memorable, and two, perhaps have a higher perceived perception in the minds of the person who's experiencing it. And if I'm not mistaken, it's one towards the end, but also the second part towards the height of that experience. And I think you've explained it really well when talking about the world of healthcare and colonoscopies.
I think the insight references what I did call the peak end rule. So the original experimenters in this area were Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in 2002, and Donald Radelmeyer. And for their experiment, and they did this in a number of different settings. So the one that always sticks in my mind is the colonoscopy experiment. So they recruit genuine colonoscopy patients. It's a 15-minute, deeply unpleasant medical procedure. Before those patients go into the operating theatre, they're given a handheld device. The device buzzes every minute, and when it buzzes, the patients have to turn a dial on the device to say how much pain they're in, from 0 to 10. Operation lasts quarter of an hour, so they get 15 ratings from the patient. These are 15 in-moment ratings, what they call the experience itself. They then wait till the patient leaves the operation theatre. They wait till they're leaving the hospital, and then the psychologist go and find that patient and ask them to reflect back on the pain level of the entire operation. So this is from the remembering self. These are reflective ratings. Psychologists wait another 2 months. They recontact the patient, and again, they ask them to reflect back on the pain level of the operation. So now they have 15 in-moment ratings and then 2 reflective ratings. Before they did this study, most people thought that the 2 sets of numbers should be roughly the same. But that is not what happens. There is only pretty poor correlation, pretty light correlation between the 2 sets of numbers. What is a much better guide to people's memory are 2 moments in particular from the experience. Just as you say, the peak moment, that's disproportionately important in shaping memory, and the final moment of the experience. So to the extent that you could have a patient who had 12 minutes of medium pain and then 3 minutes of light pain right at the end of the operation, and they would remember the operation a couple of months later as being better than another patient who'd had 12 minutes of light pain and then 3 minutes of medium pain at the end. It's the end that's particularly important at shaping what we remember. Now, that insight, first proven in colonoscopies, but also shown in more commercial settings by people like Amy Doe in prize winners and lotteries. That insight about the peak end, that can definitely be applied by any brand who's trying to create a customer experience, because every brand has a finite budget. So if you try and make every moment within your customer experience better, you're only going to be able to improve things very slightly across those 10 or 20 moments. And Conor Radelmeyer would say, well, you're just going to fritter away your budget without having an effect on memory. But if you're much more selective, if you are willing to sacrifice experience in some areas so you can create one standout moment of excellence and make sure that you end on a high, then you'll better convert your budget into positive memory. So it's a fascinating study run in a very different area, but that underlying point can absolutely be applied in marketing.
Richard, you've given us tons of brilliant examples, and you've got a new book coming out. So give me a sense of where this discipline is going. It seems like it's percolating, building. In your most optimistic self, what impact do you think this is going to have in the future of marketing?
So in terms of where the discipline's going, I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. One of the things that I really like about this discipline is the findings are evergreen. So if there is a genuine experiment, a robust experiment, and it could have come from the 1930s and the 1950s, if it's been proven a few times, you know that it's not a statistical quirk, it's a genuine finding. The great thing is they don't tend to come in out of fashion. So we've talked about the Prattville effect in 1966, the von Restel effect in 1933. These are things that are about the fundamentals of human nature. That to me is brilliant, because as a marketer it means that if you spend time learning about some of these ideas, that work will be well rewarded, because it's not like learning about a brand new technology which will no longer be in existence in 2 or 5 years' time. It's learning about the human operating system, and if you learn about that on the day that you start in marketing as a 20-year-old, it will still be relevant when you retire at 65. So that to me is something that is one of the reasons I love the field, that I actually became frustrated sometimes as a media planner that we're spending all this time learning about new formats, new channels, new technologies. But I felt like I was on this hamster wheel of, spending all this time immersing myself in a field, but not actually progressing and getting further. The wonderful thing about behavioural science is if as a marketer you learn about these areas, you can apply them today, but you can apply them in 40 years' time. So I think that's one aspect of the field that's worth mentioning. But maybe the other part which answers your question is, yes, you have the original bias discovered by a psychologist maybe 10 or 20 or 50 years ago. What current day psychologists are now doing are finding essentially nuances to the bias. We've talked about social proof, really long-standing idea, but later work has shown that it doesn't affect all people in the same way. So, for example, there's some work which has shown younger people tend to be more effective, or there's some work that's shown we tend to be more affected by social proof when we're scared. That, I think, is the cutting edge of psychology, often taking well-known existing insights and understanding how you can kind of sweat out the maximum benefit from them by learning about these nuances.
For me, Richard, the discipline is really encapsulated by, I guess, what Rory Sutherland terminology around alchemy, and the notion that you can take what perhaps is pretty obvious stroke non-obvious things in our daily lives and turn them into these magical nuggets which genuinely can add value almost out of thin air, and that can give our industry that exponential sort of growth creation factor in a world today which I think we've already, perhaps, and when you talked about things like media planning, squeezed a lot of the juice out of what there is to be had. And for me, these insights become such the cherry on the cake, the distinction factor, the distinguishing factor for brands. And I think that's why it just becomes such an important area for the future as we move forward. This has been so fascinating, Richard, and perhaps just the last question then is perhaps on a personal note. You've forged a stellar reputation across the industry, probably spoken across most, let's call it, A-lister platforms that exist today in our space. And I just wonder if there are others who are in the wings or trying to follow in your footsteps. What type of advice would you have for them in being able to perhaps, trailblaze in a space, in a place the way that you have?
One of the big bits of luck I've had, I think, is becoming interested quite early on in a field that was growing. And I think that there's an awful lot to be said for that. Try to see and predict what you think will be relevant and bigger in 10 or 15 years' time. Because some of the success I've had is the fact that just behavioural science has become much more mainstream, much more popular. So I think that's one thing. The second area is I think there's an awful lot of value of trying to develop a skill that isn't widely shared. So there are lots of behavioural scientists and there are lots of marketers, but if you can find an overlap of marketers who know about behavioural science, well, suddenly you're in a smaller set of people. And if you can create a skill set, often by overlapping two different areas, then I think that's a very kind of fertile area. Because if you have a skill that is interchangeable with thousands upon thousands of other people, it's very hard, if you're a business or an independent consultant, to charge that. But if you can forge a skill that isn't being offered in huge volumes, then I think you're on something quite good. So maybe those two areas. Be very careful about the area you specialise in, because however good you are, if it is shrinking and not of interest to business, you've got a problem. And then the second part is be very careful about being substitutable, because then there'll just be a constant pressure on wages and fees.
Great advice, great finale. Richard, thank you. Such vivid examples, so clearly explained. You've given us a masterclass in, you to use your words, the fundamentals of human behaviour and the human operating system. Richard, absolute pleasure to have you on today. Thank you so much for your time, and it will be really impactful for our audience.
Thank you very much for having me.